For a century, the social and biological sciences pursued the same goal, decoding the architecture of the human mind. Yet they did so while separated by a dark, impenetrable barrier that prevented their findings from ever crossing over. Biology followed a trajectory of rigorous, mathematically driven research, mapping how the physical structures of species evolved over millions of years to solve specific environmental problems. Psychology took a different path. It modeled human cognition as a blank slate, an all-purpose learning mechanism shaped almost entirely by culture and the immediate environment. These two disciplines existed in silos, ignoring each other's foundational principles, even as they studied the exact same organism. Evolutionary psychology emerged as the synthesis of these two histories. The unification began when biology reached a point where it required a cognitive mechanism to explain how animals actually generated complex social behaviors. At the same time, psychology discovered that its models of the mind were incomplete without the constraints of evolution. Tracing these two parallel tracks reveals the point where their findings became mutually dependent. The biological timeline began in earnest with Charles Darwin in 1859. Darwin established natural selection on three pillars: variation among individuals, the inheritance of those variations, and differential reproductive success. To explain traits that seem to hinder survival, such as bright colors or heavy ornaments, Darwin deduced the theory of sexual selection, traits that evolve strictly to facilitate mating. This occurs through intersexual selection, or mate choice. The peacock's elaborate tail is metabolically expensive and attracts predators, but it evolved because peahens chose males possessing the most brilliant plumage. Contrast this with intersexual competition. In this process, traits like large antlers or increased body size evolve for same-sex combat, where the winner gains exclusive access to mates. While Darwin's model was powerful, it lacked a mechanical explanation for how these traits were passed down. Without a theory of inheritance, it appeared that beneficial variations would simply blend away over generations. Gregor Mendel provided the solution with the discovery of particulate inheritance. He proved that traits are passed down in discrete, intact packets, what we now know as genes. This modern synthesis gave biology a mechanical foundation, but it still struggled to explain why an organism would ever sacrifice its own interests to help another. Altruism was a problem for classical fitness. If evolution favors individuals who produce the most offspring, self-sacrificing behavior should theoretically be eliminated by natural selection. In 1964, evolutionary biologist William Dive to the gene's eye view. Hamilton proposed inclusive fitness, an individual's reproductive success plus actions helping genetic relatives. Because we share 50% of our genes with siblings, but only 12.5% with cousins, the math predicts exactly when we invest in others. George Williams refined this in 1966, establishing that adaptations must be evaluated by their reliability, efficiency, and economy. This effectively replaced group selection theories with a strict focus on the individual gene. By the end of the 60s, biology could explain why traits existed, but it was still blind to the internal information processing that actually directed human behavior. On the psychological track, the mid-20th century was dominated by radical behaviorism. Behaviorists assumed the mind was a domain-general learning machine, built with no inherent nature. They believed that environmental inputs and reinforcement could shape any behavior equally. To a behaviorist, the mind was a blank slate, waiting for the world to fill it in. This model began to fail when researchers discovered behaviors that conditioning couldn't explain. Harry Harlow found that infant monkeys preferred a soft cloth surrogate over a wire surrogate that provided food. They prioritized contact comfort over the primary reinforcement of calories. John Garcia showed that rats could learn to avoid food that made them sick in a single trial, but were unable to link that same sickness to lights or sounds. These findings proved that organisms come into the world pre-programmed to learn specific things easily while ignoring others. The environment was not the only factor. These failures led to the cognitive revolution, an attempt to map the internal mental states previously dismissed as a black box. Psychology adopted an information processing metaphor, modeling the mind as software that takes inputs and applies decision rules to produce behavior. However, they carried over the assumption that this internal computer was domain general, capable of processing any data without specialized rules. This led to a theoretical limit known as the combinatorial explosion. Without specific processing rules, a computer faced with even simple choices will see its options proliferate until it cannot act. If an organism has 100 choices every minute, by minute 3 it faces 1 million possible behavioral sequences. The math proves that a system without pre-programmed constraints is effectively paralyzed. Cognitive psychologists were forced to look for a source of programming rules outside their own field. The two timelines finally met at this point of mutual crisis. Psychology needed specific rules to solve the problem of infinite choice. Evolutionary biology provided those rules. The mind is programmed to solve ancestral problems of survival and reproduction, pruning the infinite options into a functional pathway. This unification is evolutionary psychology. The mind is not a general-purpose computer, but a collection of domain-specific modules designed by natural and sexual selection. This synthesis defines the mind's architecture: biological hardware running specialized, evolutionarily tested software. This perspective is sometimes resisted because of a concern regarding genetic determinism. But evolutionary psychology explicitly rejects the idea that genes control behavior in a vacuum, independent of the environment. Evolved adaptations are strictly interactionist. Consider skin calluses. We have the genetic adaptation to grow calluses, but those genes remain dormant unless triggered by the specific environmental input of repeated physical friction. Our mental modules work the same way. They require specific social and environmental inputs to activate and influence our behavior. The human mind acts as a walking archive of ancestral wisdom, processing modern information through specialized, ancient architecture.